Well, please be seated. And good morning. It's so good to be back at St. Mary's. See a lot of faces that are familiar, a lot of new faces, and that's a wonderful thing to see. And there are those faces that I miss that I know we won't see again. I thought that we might spend a little time this morning talking about your attitude, since it seems to be an issue. Well, actually, it's not just your attitude, it's everyone's. But your attitude, you see, is especially important because as followers of Christ, your attitude has the capacity and the potential to influence the attitudes of others. And God knows our culture, our nation, our world could use a little attitude adjustment. There's a book group that I belong to in Lynchburg where Kathy and I live, and Kathy's with me this morning, by the way, and it's made up of a bunch of old guys like myself, mostly retired physicians and clergy and attorneys, and there's about 20 of us, a few business folk in there. And we meet once a week to discuss some pretty serious books. And as you might imagine, with a group of us, men of age, there's a lot of life experience in the room. Most of us have had long careers. A lot of them have been community leaders. They have fought in wars. Few have held public office. And you could say that it's a group of successful people who have gone through life with a positive attitude. Even so, I wasn't surprised when a few weeks ago we were discussing a biography of Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote that famous book, Democracy in America. And I noticed as we were talking about the book, there was this pessimistic, almost cynical attitude that pervaded our discussion. Now, I tell you I wasn't surprised, is because I've encountered that attitude before, and I encounter it all too often anymore. Our presenter that day made reference to some of the problems with which you are well familiar. Divided national politics, wars, and bloodshed throughout the world, inability to solve our problems, corruption. You could add the list, you know it. But he went on to suggest that, well, humankind's always been that way, probably always will be, and there probably isn't a whole lot that we can do about it. It's just human nature living out its assigned script. And it troubled me that I noticed a lot of head nodding in the room, which I took for general agreement. And that troubled me. Now, it's not that there isn't sufficient evidence. If you just want to read a little history of Western civilization, there's a lot in there to be cynical about. But what bothered me as a Christian person was the perceived notion that circumstances are what they are, they've always been that way, and so we just might as well accept it. That is an attitude. That is an attitude, but it is an attitude, I want to argue, that Christ came to challenge and to heal. We had a baptism at the last service, wonderful service. It was a baptism, and this, as you probably know, is the first Sunday in Advent in the church's calendar. I think that's kind of a good juxtaposition because baptism and Advent have common themes. Both of them are about hope and expectation, the kind of hope and expectation that we find grounded in our belief in the power of God to make all things new. Both Advent and baptism are intended to have an attitude-shaping influence on you. They are intended to say, something about what you believe, what you hope for, what you trust in, what you are willing to strive for, and ultimately, how you are going to live out your life in the bright light of hope and expectation that Christ came among us to proclaim. Now, I want to tell you a short and simple story about the power of attitude and how an attitude has the capacity to change what might seem like a hopeless situation, the kind of situation that could cause you to just shrug your shoulders and say, so what? There's a lady named Marva Collins who became aware of children in her hometown of Chicago that the school system had given up on. Now, these were children who had been rejected by the school system either because of their bad behavior or it had been determined that they were unable to learn. That was an attitude that was applied to these children. But Marva Collins operated out of a different attitude, one of possibility and high expectations. And she started by founding the West Side Preparatory School, which was to address the specific needs of these children. She began by holding classes in her home, struggled at first, barely had enough money to survive, but she did. But under her tutelage, those children who'd been labeled unteachable, within 4 years, they were reading Shakespeare, Emerson, and Euripides. Today, there are Marva Collins schools in several states, and educators from all over the world come to see her methods and observe her techniques. Now, yes, a lot of discipline and accountability were involved, but that wasn't the game changer for these children. The key to her success, and these are her words, listen. She said the key to her success was instilling in the children confidence in themselves and the ability to imagine a better future. That's an attitude. That's an attitude so powerful that it changed the attitude of her students and turned what seemed like a hopeless and rejected situation into one of success. It's an attitude that changed the attitudes of some educators, too. Now that, to me, sounds like the fundamental Christian attitude, the one we are reminded of in every baptism service when we affirm, remember the words? When we affirm, with God's help, we will proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ. Now, this congregation, and I can say this because I had a lot of history with you, but you all have a wonderful reputation for the work that you've done in the community, and it goes way back. You've taken positions, you've taken risks, you participated in building some low-income housing, Habitat House, transition housing project. You helped get the Piedmont School established. You fed the hungry, tutored. I was always very proud of you for that, and I'm still proud of you for the reputation you still have. And I know that some of you now, working along with Sarah Palmer, have been involved in prison ministry. Now, you know, it takes some attitude to do that. It takes some attitude. Because, you know, there are many people who think that the prisoners just get what they deserved. They probably aren't going to change. You could ignore them, and who would have noticed? It takes attitude to make a difference in people's lives. It's a Christ-like attitude. And now, as I understand with High Point, a recent designation, the second most food insecure place in the nation, you all have some challenges before you. An attitude will help. There's a teacher at the Emorywood University Candler School of Theology. His name's Thomas Long. And he wrote a recent column in the Christian Century. And in the column, He tells a story about an elderly Presbyterian woman he met years ago from the coal country of Pennsylvania. And this lady was talking about something that happened back in the 1930s. And I know that there's some truth to this because having grown up in western Pennsylvania, there were some residuals of this when there were some real boundaries between Catholics and Protestants. There wasn't a lot of intermarrying that went on. And this lady had told Long that she had made a social misstep of becoming engaged to a Catholic. And she told Long that when she did that, her community turned her back on her, and even conversations would stop when she would approach. But Long reports that all those years, she never forgot the Sunday when a respected woman in the congregation came up to her in bold defiance of the prevailing attitude, embraced this woman, put her arms around her, and said, "Every blessing of God on your marriage, honey." It was a small act of courage, but it was so important that woman remembered it for over 60 years. It doesn't take a lot of effort. In fact, it doesn't take any effort at all to surrender to cynicism and despair. It doesn't take much effort to forget that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference in somebody's life, sometimes a bigger difference than you can even imagine. Now, Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth that we read this morning as an epistle, he reminded his readers, as he still reminds you, and that's why we read these lessons on Sunday morning and why you study them, he reminds us that God has called us into a partnership with Jesus Christ, a partnership. And he has charged us with the responsibility of being Christ's representatives here on earth. That's a pretty daunting responsibility. But let's also remember what else Paul said, notably that God, who has called us into that partnership, into this holy fellowship that we have together, is faithful and reliable and has promised to strengthen us to the end. So when it comes right down to it, the one thing that's going to matter most in your life is your attitude. So how's yours? How's your attitude? And if you're concerned about it, if your attitude's getting a little negative, like my book group's was, a little cynical, well, the loving Christ, God's eternal word to humankind, is there to give you a little attitude adjustment. I want to thank you for inviting me back this morning. I wish you a productive and a provocative Advent. I hope it's a season when you contemplate well the one who came into the world to change the world, and the one who came to influence the attitude of us all.